Last week, Reverend Stacy Rector, our guest preacher for that Sunday, was kind enough to stand up here while I was away visiting my family, and she preached a sermon that she called Living as Neighbors. And in this sermon, she reflected on a reading from the Gospel of Luke, that familiar parable of the Good Samaritan. And that parable originates, if you'll recall, with the question of a lawyer to Jesus who makes sure that he wants to understand the fine print of what Jesus has been saying, asks this question, who is my neighbor? And so to answer the question, Jesus tells this parable, a parable about a man who's traveling down a road when he's beaten and robbed and left for dead in a ditch, and how people pass by him. A priest goes by and does nothing. A Levite goes by and does nothing. A Samaritan, a very much despised person, he stops and he helps the man. And so then Jesus cross-examines that lawyer and asks him, which of those who went down that road by this man lying beaten and half dead in a ditch, which of those was a neighbor? And the lawyer responds, the one who showed him mercy. Always like how the lawyer doesn't say the Samaritan, because he probably couldn't even say those words. But he does say, the one who showed him mercy. And indeed it was. Now today, I want to follow up and consider the great sister act of the New Testament, the story of Mary and Martha. And this account, this story of Mary and Martha, it follows directly on the heels of the parable of that Samaritan. And I believe that Luke purposely places these two stories side by side to show us how we, as Christians, as neighbors, are to find a balance in our lives. So, in our reading for today, Luke tells us that Jesus and his disciples are traveling, and they're generally headed towards Jerusalem. They're still up in Galilee. And as was their custom, they sought out hospitality in the villages that they passed through. And we read that they came to a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomes Jesus into her home. Martha has a sister whose name is Mary. And Jesus and his disciples, they accept this invitation and they go to the sister's home where the sisters take on different tasks. Mary chooses to sit at Jesus' feet, listening to what he has to say. When Luke describes Mary as sitting at Jesus' feet, he means that she was really treating him as a student would treat their teacher. She defers to him as teacher, and she is there to bask in his words. The Apostle Paul, for example, in the book of Acts, describes himself as having been, quote, brought up at the feet of Rabbi Gamaliel, who was a great teacher at the time. To be at one's feet means that you are there to learn. So Mary chooses to place herself at Jesus' feet, listening to his words, absorbing, contemplating, reflecting on what he has to say. And isn't that what all of us would do if we had the opportunity to be with Jesus? Wouldn't we just drop everything to listen to him? However, by choosing to be with Jesus, that meant that Mary was not someplace else, and that someplace else was in the kitchen with her sister Martha, helping prepare the meal for all these guests that they've just invited over. Martha, back in the kitchen, I'm sure she would like to be out there listening to the rabbi. But she also knows that that meal ain't going to fix itself, so she could really use a little help from somebody, her sister. And So you can be sure that Martha banged some pots and slammed some cabinets and muttered loud but carefully muffled words. And she tried to create enough of a stir that maybe her sister out there would get the message. Come back and help her. I mean, none of us have ever done anything like that. But Mary doesn't budge. She stays out there listening to Jesus. So Martha quickly gives up the subtle approach and she makes her frontal attack. And she goes straight out there, goes to Jesus and demands, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her to come and help me. Can you imagine how uncomfortable that was? Have you ever gone to someone's house and gotten caught in their fight that they're having? Ugh. But why Martha goes to Jesus and just not straight to her sister, it's not explained. Maybe she's just so mad at Mary that she can't even speak to her. She's doing what psychologists call triangulating, by going to a third party to bring in the second party. It's complicated. Or, and maybe she thinks that Jesus will side with her and see the obvious need for Mary back in the kitchen. And I've also just wondered if maybe she was hoping that Jesus would pull that feeding the 5,000 trick and fix the meal himself, and that would solve everybody's problem, wouldn't it? But Jesus says to her, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken from her. He's not going to make Mary leave listening to him. Now, traditionally in this sibling conflict, we usually view Mary as the winner of this contest because she gets Jesus' approval, doesn't she? And Martha seems to get a little slap on the wrist. And it would appear that sitting at Jesus' feet in a posture of learning is more valuable than to be engaged in anxious and sometimes maybe even unnecessary service. But I'd like to ask you to join with me in rethinking, challenging this traditional view of this story. And so let's quit beating up on Martha as we do, and let's look at this story not as a win-lose, but as a call for resolution, a call for balance. So let's take a moment and consider the three principal figures in the story. There's Mary, there's Martha, and there's Jesus. Well, first of all, Mary. Mary really does make the better choice. She chooses the better part because visiting with Jesus sure beats trying to stretch a meatloaf for a bunch of drop-in visitors. Mary sets her priority. She recognizes the better portion. But you can't help but think maybe she could have given her sister a hand. And then there's Martha. We must not forget that it was Martha, as the scripture is very clearly points out, she was the one who welcomed Jesus into their home. Mary didn't invite Jesus. Martha did. Martha's the mover and the shaker. And as the host, it's her role to provide food to the travelers. They weren't going to find food anywhere else. And Martha is anxious to fix a meal worthy for Jesus. But she feels unprepared. And she's so overwhelmed by her anxiety that she loses sight of the goal of what she's trying to do. And we've all known people who get so caught up in the busyness of what they're doing that they forget the business of what they're doing. Our English translation says that Martha was distracted by her many tasks. Literally, she was distracted about much service. Because that word service in the Greek is diakonion, a word closely related to our word deacon. which in the Greek means to serve. Martha wasn't just busy in the kitchen. She was literally deaconing. She was serving in the name of Jesus. And it doesn't help, however, that Martha reacts to the situation by playing the game of poor me, where somebody goes around saying how rough their life is, how tough it is, and then everyone else has to agree with them and respond, poor you, poor me, poor you. It goes back and forth. But Jesus doesn't play Martha's game. And that brings us to our third point, which is Jesus and his response to the situation. As I said a moment ago, traditionally we interpret Jesus' response as being harsh on Martha. From the story, it would appear that Mary gets the pat on the back. But let's challenge that. Let's go on. The story doesn't say that Jesus rebuked Martha. No. He never says that Martha is wrong. Quite the contrary. He's in fact very gentle, very understanding with her, very compassionate. He shows understanding when he says, Martha, you are worried. He identifies her anxiety. And then he takes that situation and he puts it in focus when he says, you are distracted by many things. And then finally, he offers her guidance. There is need of only one thing. You see what Jesus has done here? He's taken the situation and he's directed her to where she needs to be. There is need of only one thing. And Jesus doesn't say to Mary that she's a better person. No, he doesn't judge either of them. What he does say is that Mary has chosen the better part. He doesn't say that she chose the best part, does he? Just better. So what is the best part? Is that out there? Well, the best part, I believe, is being able to strike a balance between being, like Mary, being with Jesus, and doing, like Martha, by sitting with the Lord, but also by preparing for his coming, Mary and Martha. Remember Jesus' question to that lawyer in the previous story from last week? Which of these, Jesus asked, was a neighbor? Was it the priest, the Levite, or the Samaritan? Now, if we apply this question to Mary and Martha, what's the answer? Which one is a better neighbor to Jesus? Is it Martha, who wants to see to his needs and provide him with food? Or is it Mary, who wants to spend time with him, listen to his words? He is a teacher, and she wants to be the student. Martha, back in the kitchen, she indeed chose a good part. She is serving. Mary, we're told, she chooses a better part. But I believe together, as a household, they really make the best part, because together we find this balance. The Mary-Martha conflict is in each of us as we seek to lead lives that are as fulfilling as possible. We can't make that conflict within us disappear. Some of us will label ourselves as Marthas, and some of us see ourselves as Marys, but we've all got part of the other within us. And it's in tension, pulling us one way or another, this way and that. What Mary did, sitting at Jesus' feet, that was good. It was better. But Martha's service in the kitchen was also good. And the conflict arose because Martha was anxious about what she was doing. And for some reason, she lost sight of the purpose of serving. And I think this story could easily be flipped around, and the focus could land on Mary instead of Martha. Because imagine that Mary goes out and sits at Jesus' feet, But all the time she's yelling back at her sister, Martha, Martha, you gotta get in here. You gotta get in here and listen to what he's got to say. He's talking. You need to hear this. Martha, where are you? Lord, can't you make my sister come out of the kitchen for a minute? They could easily go that way. And what would Jesus say? It's okay, Mary, don't be anxious. Your sister is doing good things. It's not about what we do, but it's about our attitude as we do it. At the risk of sounding very 1970s, we need to lose ourselves in the moment. So consider the church. Which would be better? A congregation composed all of Marys, or one composed only of Marthas? Wednesday nights would be excellent with Marthas. Or about half of each, with the Marys glued to their pews in the sanctuary and the Marthas out in the fellowship hall, staging a bake sale, a daycare, literacy class, soup kitchen, clothes closet, and stress management seminar, all at the same time, because that's what they do. So let's look at the wisdom from Ecclesiastes for some guidance. It says, for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. We take those words and apply them to how it is that we are to act moment to moment. Robert McAfee Brown is a Presbyterian minister and theologian, and he has a sermon on this passage. And in this sermon, he says, I think our tendency around here is to be more Martha-like than Mary-like. We are addicted to noise and activity. And I want to emphasize the need to include Mary times in our lives as personal Bible study, meditation, silence, worship, corporate worship, etc. He goes on to say, if we fail to strike the balance, then we run the risk of, on the one hand, pious irrelevance, and on the other, destructive burnout. And I will admit that as a pastor, this is my challenge every day of every week, to find that balance between the being and the doing, the listening and the fixing. It's too easy for me to be more Mary than Martha as I, juggle all the pesky little details at a church that can easily consume a week. I mean, just for example, as I was thinking about it, this week, over 2 days, I've spent over an hour just trying to make that little camera there work so that those who are watching online can be with us in person and have a better experience. Little things. You can get caught up in these. My to-do list can easily become an avalanche of distractions. And I have to stop every now and then and take that breath and set Martha aside and try to be intentionally more like Mary. The lesson that I find in this story about these two sisters is that we as Christians, we are stronger when we are in community. Yes, we've got our individual faults and our individual gifts, but if we're able to combine our strengths, then we're better able to fulfill our mission to be, a welcoming community of disciples of Jesus Christ, continually demonstrating God's reign. And that's not the good part. That's not the better part. That's really the best part. Amen.